Thank you, Andrew. Dean Rutherford, ladies and gentlemen, it's a tremendous honor for me to be standing here in front of you today. I was given a tour of the Clinton Library this morning, and Bob G. Told me about some of the other very distinguished guests at the school who have stood at this podium, and I'm actually very humbled by being in their company, in your company, and having this opportunity to share with you a little bit of our mission and some of the challenges associated with that mission in Afghanistan. Also welcome my military colleagues. Let me ask, have any of you served in Afghanistan? Just one. What I've been focused on over the past 18 months has been, as Andrew shared with you, just a part of our overall mission in Afghanistan. I've been working on helping the Afghan government put into place a functioning justice system and help them adhere to the rule of law. Before getting into that subject in some more depth, I want to just assure you that our mission in Afghanistan is much broader. We still have about just short of 100,000 U.S. Troops in Afghanistan that are very much engaged in fighting a very active and violent insurgency, as well as pursuing the remnants of al-Qaeda that still operate in parts of Afghanistan and in Pakistan, just to Afghanistan's east. We also have in support of our military effort, we have a broad civilian assistance program in Afghanistan. Our embassy in Kabul is the largest in the world, remarkably. There's some 1,200 either foreign service officers like myself or other members of civilian agencies working either in Kabul or in the field in Afghanistan. And they're supporting the largest bilateral assistance program in the world, largely funded by the United States, but there are also other members of the international community that are also seriously engaged in Afghanistan. And in that effort, as I was discussing with some of the students here at the school, we're trying to assist the Afghan government raise the livelihoods of its citizens out of a very, very low and basic place in the world. Afghanistan is one of the very poorest countries. Its people are judged largely to be illiterate and innumerate. It's estimated that 85% or more of the Afghan citizenry cannot read or write and cannot use numerals. And as a result, and also roughly 85% of the population is engaged in just very, very basic subsistence agriculture. And so with that low human capacity, it's the challenges of putting Afghanistan on a path towards stability and prosperity, as well as the adherence to the rule of law and the development of democratic institutions is, to begin with, very, very difficult. And then on top of that, Afghanistan is fighting, again, a very active insurgency that's trying to bring down the government. And it's doing this in the context of almost unrelenting violence that has beset the country for almost 4 decades now. Since the mid-1970s, Afghanistan has suffered a socialist revolution, including the invasion by the Soviet Union that is estimated to have killed 1 million people. It has suffered an Islamic revolution after the Soviets left and after the collapse of the the government that the Soviets left behind in 1992, 1993, which led to the introduction of the Taliban government that was also violent and did not lead to the economic development of the country. And then after 9/11, after Al-Qaeda used Afghanistan as a base from which to attack the United States, to attack New York and Washington in September of 2001, Afghanistan is still going through a democratic revolution where the United States, or Afghanistan is going through a democratic revolution where the United States, as well as other members of the international community, are trying to assist Afghanistan in building the institutions necessary to develop both the democratic institutions, but also an economy that can help raise the prosperity and the prospects for prosperity for Afghan citizens. And within that effort, both military and civilian, one important piece of it has been the work that I've had the privilege over the past 18 months of leading and overseeing, and that is helping, again, the Afghan government develop institutions that adhere to the rule of law, and develop institutions that can provide justice and dispute resolution to Afghan citizens, services that are fair, free, and efficient, that help the people of Afghanistan resolve their disputes. So what I'd like to do is just provide an overview of this part of our work in Afghanistan currently, and then open up the floor to questions and answers. And I'd be very happy to talk about, to the extent that I can, any other aspect of our mission there. Why is the rule of law important? The U.S. military and civilian engagement in the current Afghanistan conflict has lasted more than 10 years. There are many factors driving the conflict, but at its heart, we believe, lies a competition between the government of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan and the insurgents to provide leadership and justice to the Afghan population. In too many parts of Afghanistan, this competition is very, very real. Judges appointed by the Afghan Supreme Court vie with Taliban judges for legitimacy, for the provision of resolving disputes. The Taliban and the Afghan judges vie for the respect and loyalty of the local people. And from this respect and loyalty is derived the leadership and legitimacy upon which the Afghan state depends. Legitimacy cannot be contrived or manufactured. It must be earned through behavior. A government is only as sustainable as it is legitimate in the eyes of its citizens. It can be argued that the strongest element in a government's legitimacy relates to its ability to deliver justice and resolve disputes among its citizenry. Justice is therefore not only a concept of moral righteousness or ethical rationality in the law, but justice is also the services designed and provided by a government to fashion and maintain good order, discipline, and equity for its citizens. Justice is a part of every citizen's daily life. This is why the government of Afghanistan and the international community has made the rule of law a centerpiece of our mission to assist the Afghan government in its struggle against the insurgency. It is our belief that in order to win this fight against the insurgency, the Afghan government must not only be able to, and its coalition partners, be able to fight and defeat the insurgency on the battlefield, but it must also, the Afghan government must also be seen as legitimate to all of its citizens, and in order to develop that legitimacy, it has to provide basic services, and the most fundamental of those services is the provision of justice and means of resolving disputes. The history of the rule of law, or supporting the rule of law, or supporting the Afghan government's efforts to put into place a working system of justice and law enforcement is checkered. After the United States and its partners, coalition partners, invaded Afghanistan in the fall of 2001, and then sought in the subsequent years, 2002, 2003, to provide essential, or help the Afghan government provide essential security, but also put itself on a path of development. Different countries assume different sectors as a means of focusing the international community's assistance. In the case of justice, Italy raised its hand and said that it would provide the necessary financial resources as well as the technical assistance necessary to develop the capacity of the Afghan justice system. And they took it seriously, but didn't bring adequate resources to the mission. That's probably one fault, and so other countries began to see a need, and in the United States in roughly 2004, 2005, particularly concerned with the growing production and trafficking of narcotics in Afghanistan, we started to put some resources into developing justice institutions in Afghanistan as well. Also, about mid-decade, there was a general review by the international community of its role in Afghanistan, and the United Nations raised its hand, let's say, I think probably in roughly 2005, 2006, and said that it would take the lead for developing justice institutions in Afghanistan from Italy. And Italy, I think, happily withdrew its leadership in this area. And then that didn't work either. The United Nations has a large effort in Afghanistan, but it never was able to bring the necessary personnel or financial resources to make a serious effort in either donor coordination in the justice area or actual investment in the Afghan institutions that required support. And so as the United States started to look at expanding our military effort in 2008, and especially in 2009 with the beginning of the Obama administration, we also looked at everything else that we were either trying to accomplish in Afghanistan or believed that had to be accomplished in order for the military effort to succeed. And so we started to increase our investment, the U.S. investment in the area of rule of law dramatically, alongside with a large expansion of our broader civilian development effort in Afghanistan in 2009 and 2010. And it was in 2010 that my position was created to better coordinate the U.S. Military and civilian effort in the area of rule of law and law enforcement. And I arrived in Afghanistan in July of 2010 to do so. So again, I just want to emphasize that on paper and in actuality, I was responsible for all military and civilian programs in law enforcement and justice in Afghanistan. So what are the conditions facing the Afghan people and the Afghan institutions of justice? Why is this such a difficult undertaking? I think the first contributing factor to the difficulties and obstacles that we face in putting in place a functioning justice system there, in addition to the background, the macro background of Afghanistan relating to its very low human capacity, again, with, as I mentioned before, 85% of this population at least being illiterate and innumerate, and therefore having very weak foundation to build any functioning institution. The number one factor that undermines the operation of a system of justice in Afghanistan is the production and trafficking of narcotics, in my view. Afghanistan is the largest producer of opium in the world. The UN estimates that at least 2/3 of all opium produced in the world is grown in Afghanistan. And the trafficking and it's also the largest producer of cannabis now in the world. And the trafficking of both opium and cannabis into international markets provides revenues that equal perhaps between 15 and 20% of Afghanistan's gross domestic product. 15 or 20% of the income that economy generates is due to the production of drugs. And these are not legitimate markets that these drugs go into. It's just like in the United States, they're illicit markets. And so all the money that's being generated goes into the hands essentially of criminals. And that feeds into Afghanistan's second largest obstacle to putting in place a functioning justice system, and that is corruption. Afghanistan is judged by the World Bank and Transparency International and other organizations that track these issues as being the second most corrupt country in the world. Right after, it's a tie with Somalia and Burma for number one. And the corruption is pervasive. It happens both at the daily level of when somebody's trying to get a license to either open a business or to drive a car, to the very, very highest levels. And again, a lot of that corruption is a result of the illicit trade in narcotics. As I mentioned before, Afghanistan has suffered more than 3 decades of ongoing, unrelenting conflict, and this has corroded all of its public institutions, including the court system. But in addition to that, the Taliban, the insurgents, are very determined enemies of the Afghan state, and one of their mechanisms that they've developed over the past couple of years to undermine the Afghan state is to assassinate Afghan leaders, and not only at the very highest levels of the central government, but also community leaders. And so, particularly in the southern and eastern parts of the country that are most affected by the insurgency, there's been an ongoing campaign of assassination to kill judges, to kill prosecutors, but then also to kill local community leaders that have been responsible throughout Afghan's history for much of the mechanisms of resolving disputes. There's also the Afghan justice system, even before conflict, open conflict began in the 1970s, was always weak. The central state in Afghanistan always had a weak presence, particularly outside of Kabul and the major cities. And even though during what's now looked back on as a golden age for Afghanistan, the period from roughly 1925 to 1975, the state was able to place a judge in every district of Afghanistan. Nevertheless, the footprint of the central government was always very, very weak. Afghanistan is the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, so it also has, there's a competition in the justice system between Sharia law and statutory law. That's actually not as severe as one might anticipate, but nevertheless, it does exist. And Afghan judges, when they're delivering decisions, have to convince a very traditional population that it's adhering to basic Islamic principles and as expressed in Sharia law. Because of the conflict, currently much of the countryside of Afghanistan does not have much representation by representatives of the Afghan government. It's estimated that in a quarter of, in Afghanistan, there's 34 provinces, and then there's 365 or so districts, equivalent to our local governments. It's estimated that on a district level, and the intention by the court is to have in each district at minimum one judge, one prosecutor, one public defender, and all the other accoutrements that go with a functioning court system, investigators, police, clerks, what have you. It's estimated that in 1/4 of Afghanistan's districts, there is no judge. And sometimes it's simply due because the security situation doesn't permit it. Sometimes it's due to the lack of will by a judge that's being assigned to a certain district from actually serving in that district, because he's either afraid of his personal security, or he's more comfortable living in Kabul or another city. And then roughly 1/3 of the districts do not have a sitting prosecutor in them. So again, the state is, at least in the justice sector, largely absent in big chunks of the country. For millennia, probably, the primary means of resolving disputes in Afghanistan is for disputants to go to the local community leaders in an informal system to resolve disputes, whether it be over land or family disputes, or even allegations of robbery or theft or even murder. The traditional means of solving disputes has been go to a shura or jirga that's made up by local community leaders. This informal system is still very vibrant throughout Afghanistan, even in major cities. And it's estimated that, again, maybe up to 90% of disputes, particularly non-criminal disputes, again, over property or what have you, or family issues, are resolved through these traditional means. But here too, because of these assassination campaigns that I've mentioned, those informal mechanisms have been corroded somewhat over the past couple of decades. And then also there's very weak linkages between those informal means of resolving dispute and the formal system. I'm not sure what the practice is here in Arkansas, but I once had a property dispute with a tenant of mine that I was leasing my condo to in Washington, D.C. And in Washington, for minor disputes like that, you had to go through arbitration. You couldn't, if you filed a suit, you would be forced to go to arbitration first before it goes to the court system. And then once that arbitration process is completed, the court actually recognizes the result of that arbitration. It's been a goal to do something similar in Afghanistan, but the central government, the formal justice system, is very reluctant to recognize those informal practices for, I think, a variety of reasons. And there's an ideology, if meeting with the Supreme Court or the National Prosecutor's Office, that only their decisions are legitimate, but this creates a actual distrust by the people of particularly those who live in rural areas and don't have much contact with the formal government. It generates mistrust regarding the intentions of those formal government actors. And then the final obstacle I'd just like to point to is to the creation of a functioning justice system is that there has been an unfortunate history of weak coordination among the international community. that's been interested in trying to invest in solving these problems and strengthening Afghan institutions. And one of the goals that I've had and that the U.S. Embassy has had over the past 18 months is to use the greater investment that we're making there to improve coordination so that the investments that we're making in Afghanistan are used in focused, targeted ways and do not create overlaps or unnecessary inefficiencies. What I'd like to do now is just touch briefly on what our strategy has been for Afghanistan in this area. Very fundamentally, it is to help the Afghan government strengthen its ability to provide fair, efficient, transparent justice to its system, to its citizens, in order to strengthen the legitimacy of the Afghan government and through that stronger legitimacy to improve the fight against the insurgency. We've had four pillars that have been supporting this strategy. One, we've been making investments in the formal justice actors, in strengthening the Supreme Court, in providing training to judges, prosecutors, in investigation on just sometimes very, very basic principles of law enforcement, to develop the future generation of Afghan judicial actors by working with law schools in Afghanistan to strengthen their curricula and the training that they provide students. To look at all of the key actors within the justice system and to explore ways that we can make them more legitimate and effective providers of justice. We also have a large investment in corrections, in developing a corrections system in Afghanistan that can ensure the humane and secure treatment of people who are found guilty of a crime and put into jail. Each province in Afghanistan has a prison, and I've visited probably roughly half of them, and some of them are medieval, frankly, in their conditions, in their infrastructure. Very, very, even the best are very, very basic in their design and the comfort that they provide to prisoners, but some of them are shocking in the lack of infrastructure that they possess. We're also doing some work in the informal sector. This is very sensitive and actually controversial. As I mentioned, the Afghan central government would prefer that I've actually spoken to several Supreme Court justices that deny the existence of an informal system of dispute resolution in Afghanistan, of communal or traditional forms of dispute resolution. And as part of this ideology, they prefer that not only do they not pay attention to informal mechanisms, but that the international community also not invest in them. And then there's also another question: what can a foreigner who is not conversant with or does not have full understanding of how these traditional mechanisms operate, what can he or she do to help strengthen them? And we were cognizant of these difficulties, and so we went in very, very carefully in 2010 with a program to explore what a assistance program sponsored by the United States could do in communities that, because of conflict or otherwise, may not have those traditional mechanisms operating in a way that people could, or through corruption is another problem. Anyway, those mechanisms were not operating in a way that disputes could be resolved at the communal level. And what we found is that there was a need. Some of it, or largely what it consisted of, there was a lack of understanding within communities of how the formal system operated, what the Constitution was, what it contained, what the formal set of laws, both Sharia and statutory, what what were the principles inherent in them, and how did they operate? And so what we're able to do over time is essentially provide basic legal education to communities, and also help them explore how to link their mechanisms of resolving disputes with the formal system. And we've had some success in both, particularly in developing legal education programs for communities, but also in developing a registry system by which local communities could take their decisions to a judge and have it recorded. And then we've also done really, in some cases, remarkable work in developing specialized law enforcement units within the Afghan police and law enforcement community. Believe it or not, but the largest overseas presence of FBI agents in the world is in Afghanistan. The largest presence of U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration agents and officials is in Afghanistan. Not in Mexico, not in Colombia, but in Afghanistan. The largest presence of assistant U.S. attorneys overseas is in Afghanistan. The largest group of Department of Homeland Security officials assigned overseas is in Afghanistan. And using their expertise as law enforcement officers, we've been trying to develop similar, if still rudimentary, but similar skills among Afghan Customs and Border Police, Afghan Drug Enforcement Police, Counter-Narcotics Police, Afghan law enforcement officers that are targeting organized crime, corruption, and kidnapping. We're trying to use our expertise to develop, again, some basic law enforcement skills that we've had a good track record of developing in other countries overseas, and actually we've had some success in Afghanistan as well. So what is the outlook for developing effective, clean, transparent systems of justice in Afghanistan? It's definitely mixed. We've had some success, but developing these institutions simply takes time. And we're working against the clock. One thing I should have mentioned at the beginning is that both our civilian and military effort are now kind of time-bound by a goal to, by the end of 2014, to transition full responsibility for security throughout Afghanistan to the Afghan security forces. Now, and in line with that objective, to reduce our military investment in Afghanistan. President Obama has announced that in addition to some 10,000 troops that were withdrawn in the past 6 months, that another 23,000 will be withdrawn by the end of this summer. And while there's an outlook that there will be a ongoing U.S. military presence in Afghanistan, an international coalition military presence in Afghanistan, as long as the country remains somewhat insecure, the hope is by 2014, 2015, we can reduce that military investment substantially. And in concert with that, on the civilian side as well, we're looking at this period right now between 2012 and 2014 as a way of focusing our investments in such a way that they lead to endurable Afghan institutions and an ability to provide services on their own. But developing a court system, developing those law enforcement skills takes time. As Andrew mentioned, I was in East Timor, another very troubled new country that came out of also 3 decades of conflict. And we've been working with the prosecutor's office and the Ministry of Justice and the court system there since 2003, 2004 to develop their capabilities. We've been doing similar work in Jakarta for probably 25 years. We've been doing similar work in other developing countries for probably decades in some cases. And I anticipate that as long as the American people are willing to make the investment, that even if the Afghan conflict is hopefully peacefully resolved in the next couple of years, that we will still have programs to support the development of these justice and law enforcement institutions in Afghanistan for many years to come. But the outlook is also darkened somewhat by our partner in Afghanistan. I mentioned the problems with international donor coordination. There's also a very, very serious problem within coordination among the justice, the key justice institutions in Afghanistan. Just a quick aside, the European Union was looking at increasing their investment in this area and had the idea that we should probably, or they should probably find out from the Afghans first about their priorities. And so in January of last year, the ambassador from Brussels in Kabul decided to call together a meeting to include the Chief Justice of Afghanistan, the Minister of Justice, the Prosecutor General, and sent out invitations to a lunch where they'd have a nice little discussion about Afghan priorities for this area. They first got the acceptances from each of these leaders, these Afghan leaders. And then once the Afghan leaders found out that they had all been invited to this meeting, they started to pull their reservations, or their acceptances to lunch to be hosted by the European ambassador, because they didn't want to sit down with their ministerial partners and come up with a coordinated approach on how the international community should distribute its investment in their institutions. And so just getting the Afghans to coordinate and develop a national plan for the strengthening of their justice institutions has proven to be very, very difficult. The other key issues, as I mentioned, I want to wrap up and allow plenty of time for questions, is that's going to continue to make our work difficult in this area is corruption. Corruption, unfortunately, taints all institutions of governance in Afghanistan, including the court system, including the prosecutor. For example, the Prosecutor General in Afghanistan during the 18 months that I was there did not bring a single case of corruption against a serious mid to high level official, not one. Consequently, there's a sense of impunity that is enjoyed by Afghan leaders, which does grievous harm to not only the sense of justice that the Afghan citizens feel that they enjoy, or the legitimacy that the government as a result enjoys from its citizens, but also very much damages the business and investment climate in Afghanistan. And then finally, that problem with narcotics. It cannot be underestimated how serious that is. Just as it has operated here in the United States and in Mexico and Colombia and other countries that have faced this scourge, it leads to organized crime. It leads to the infiltration at the highest levels of government of narco traffickers. It undermines government institutions. In the case of Afghanistan, narco trafficking is a major provider of finance for the insurgency. It's estimated that the Taliban receive up to 50% of the financing that they need to put people in the battlefield from narco trafficking. And so our work there is, as in many other areas in Afghanistan, is not easy, but it is work that must be accomplished in the end by Afghanistan in order to provide a functioning justice system that enjoys the confidence of its people and fights fights not only the financing of the insurgency that it faces, but also fights the corruption and the undermining of its institutions that's created by the production and trafficking of narcotics, for example. So on that kind of dour note, let me conclude. I went on a little bit longer than I intended, but I'd be very interested in hearing your comments and trying to respond to some of your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. We do have some time for questions. We'll call on you and get a microphone to you. Start right here at the table.
You mentioned, of course, we know the importance of building a nation, the economic institutions, and of course, the key to that is contract enforcement. With a tribal setting, do you see any optimism in the ability for outside investors as well as investment within the country to be successful in that area?
Yeah, most of my work, frankly, and most of the work by the international community in this area really has focused on criminal law. I'm very conscious that in order for Afghanistan to develop and to attract investment, particularly foreign investment, it also needs to develop a well-functioning civil law program, including one that develops expertise in contract law. There is the investment climate, as I just touched on, is very difficult in Afghanistan. In addition to being ranked as the second most corrupt country in the world, it falls very, very low in a World Bank index of doing business, of ease of doing business. It's very difficult. I don't think it's necessarily difficult to start a company, but even there, I'm sure there's lots of corruption in licensing. But resolving contract disputes, I think, even though there is a court that handles commercial disputes, I anticipate that that there are a lot of problems with resolving contract disputes. Afghanistan has some potential, and it needs to be conscious of these problems. If it's going to develop economically, it's going to have to attract foreign investment in, for example, extractive industries. Afghanistan is thought by the U.S. Geological Survey to be sitting on $3 trillion worth of either petroleum, natural gas, or rare earth metals. So it has a potential for natural resource development and as a consequence, the development of its economy. And it's starting to attract some investment in these areas, but until it develops those mechanisms to resolve sophisticated business disputes, that's also going to provide an obstacle to investment.
I'm going to go all the way in the back.
Sir, first of all, thank you for your service, and certainly moving around that country, it's got to put yourself at risk, so appreciate that. Why don't we just buy up those poppies and destroy them?
Interesting question. We've tried different things in different countries with some success. Colombia has, due to a number of factors, including a government that realized about 10 years ago that the production of cocaine in Colombia was seriously undermining not only the democratic institutions but the economic survivability of the country. They changed course, and they've actually led, with our support, a pretty successful effort against narcotics production and trafficking. Similarly, Thailand 30 years ago was a major producer of opiates and no longer is. So there are success stories that we and the international community can point to. In Afghanistan, we and our partners have tried various things at various points in time to tackle this problem with no lasting success, at least to date, including robust eradication efforts that were strongly opposed to by the Afghan government, because they saw that if you take a farmer that is either planting wheat or poppy for just simple basic subsistence, if you take that poppy away from him, and if he didn't have a chance to plant something else, he's going to be out of pocket for a year, and his family is going to face even starvation. And that farmer's not going to be particularly happy with the government after his poppy crop is eradicated if there's no other alternatives given to him. So eradication really is still part of the solution, we believe, but a thoroughgoing eradication effort has not worked in the past. And so now we have a combination of eradication, developing alternative livelihoods for farmers, putting in place a criminal justice system there that can hopefully not only interdict the trafficking of narcotics, but actually prosecute mid to high level traffickers and put them away. Just out and out buying of the poppy, that has not been proposed. I'm not sure if the American taxpayer would support it, frankly, but shouldn't rule it out.
Heath, yeah.
Heath Carlock, I'm a second-year Clinton School student, and it's a pleasure to have you. Anywhere in our country, it's an honor to hear someone say, I'm going to law school, or I'm in law school, or I have a law degree. What impression do you get in Afghanistan when a young person or person of middle age says, I'm going to go to law school, or I'm in law school, or I have a law degree? Is it seen as bad, good, what have you?
It's seen, one, as very good. I think the prestige that the law has in the Afghan culture is very similar to the prestige it enjoys here in the United States. I know there's different views about lawyers, but the ambition to go to law school and do well and graduate and then join a distinguished profession is all of that is very true in Afghanistan, just as it is here. And one of the probably most inspiring parts of my work in Afghanistan has been the programs that we have with law schools there and spending time with law students. We sponsor, for example, moot court competitions in Afghanistan, and I've seen Afghan students in those competitions, and again, it's just very, very inspiring because they take it very seriously and they work hard and they develop the skills that go along with legal reasoning and argumentation. You know, the bad. I don't want to be relentless in my my sharing with you of bad news is bad news. However. Recently, I had spent some time with a professor of Sharia law at Kabul University, the most prestigious in the country, and I shared with him that one of the most inspiring things of my work here in Afghanistan has been the time that I've spent with Afghan law students, and he said, "Yeah, that's why I'm doing. That's why I'm a professor of law as well." But he said the unfortunate thing is that after they graduate, after they actually become prosecutors or judges, they're immediately hit by the culture of corruption that exists in the country. And it's in order to resist it, it's physically threatening to a young Afghan female or male judge or prosecutor that they have to collaborate, unfortunately, in corruption in order to provide for their physical security and that of their families. So that was one of the most discouraging conversations I had during my 18 months of service is with that professor.
Right there. Yeah, we'll do them back to back since that's the question row. Every person on that row had to ask a question.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I'm very glad you're here in Little Rock today. A couple of thoughts I'd like for you to comment upon. One is that in other areas of the Islamic world, particularly the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the UAE, we had situations where over multiple decades the tribes came together and recognized a sovereign who had the authority to move forward under the rule of law. And the outcome has been a little bit different. If you compare Saudi Arabia to, for instance, Dubai, with Saudi Arabia, with King Abdullah saying that he wanted the law codified, and yet that was ignored, and he is the absolute sovereign. And then in the UAE, they decided that they wanted to have Western investment, and they created within certain trade zones something that is very familiar to the West, basically adopted the Uniform Commercial Code as a way to attract investment. And I'm very interested to see how your work is trying to draw parallels between how those two regions came together to have their own version of the rule of law, and then secondly, with respect to the narcotic trafficking in Afghanistan, there are other parts of the Islamic world where that is punishable by death. And beyond just the rule of law, society rejects that as well. And so how do you start trying to tie all these things together so that you can move forward?
Thank you for those observations. In the case of Afghanistan, they began developing a statutory law system already in the late 19th century, and then really began to build that out in the 1960s when they put into place in 1964 a new constitution, and then there was a very deliberate effort to develop a full body of statutory law based on Islamic principles and operating in parallel with a Sharia law system, or using Sharia law principles in informing the development of their statutory law system. They used the genesis of the Afghan legal system, particularly statutory law, was from Switzerland, actually, and via Egypt. Afghan legal scholars who had studied in Egypt at the famous law schools, Islamic law schools that are still operating there, took or used mentors from Switzerland to write their statutory law program. So it's a common law, civil law system, and there's no dispute in Afghanistan now. At least I never encountered anything about the legitimacy of their legal system. So I think the legal foundation is firm enough there to support the development of a vibrant business community based on the rule of law and ability to resolve disputes through contracts, or to resolve disputes that develop through the implementation of contracts. But unfortunately, unlike Saudi Arabia and unlike the UAE, Afghanistan really hasn't been able to resolve some fundamental internal conflicts that have really corroded institutions and torn apart the country repeatedly, as I mentioned, over the past 4 years. They haven't enjoyed that period of peace and consolidation that the UAE and Saudi Arabia has a period of extended peace that some of their neighbors have been able to enjoy. And I think that is a fundamental both cause cause of the failure for the Afghan state to develop institutionally, and for the failure of the economy to develop. And until they're able to find that that extended era of peace, I think it's going to be very, very difficult for them to complete basic institution building and be able to attract investment. I mean, the Afghans and we and other donors from the international community have had ongoing conversations with them about the development of free trade zones, about the development of bilateral free trade areas between Afghanistan and Pakistan, Afghanistan and its neighbors up in the north, in order to support the development of energy resources, to put into place a pipeline, for example, to bring oil from Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan down through Afghanistan and ship it out through Pakistani ports. But all this stuff is very hard to do when you have an ongoing insurgency that's killing Afghan not only soldiers but civilians in the range of several thousand every year.
Well, Mr. Ambassador, we have run out of time. Thank you so much for coming and visiting us, and thank all of y'all for coming out tonight.